In this video, I'm going to show you how to harvest the nutritious leaves of kale and Swiss chard in our 24 beautiful new vegetable garden beds at Lincoln Elementary School. There are 3 varieties of kale and a colorful Swiss chard variety called Bright Lights. There are 4 beds for each of these, and they were planted from transplants on December 19th last year, which was the last day of school before we went on winter break. And now they're getting large enough for us to start harvesting them and of course eating them. I'm going to give you a few tips on how to harvest the leaves so that we can produce as much kale and chard as possible from each of the plants without damaging them. I'll also show you how we can keep a few simple records for each of these harvests so that we can get as much useful information on how much food we produced in our new garden. The plants are arranged in 5 to 6 lines that run the long direction of the courtyard, and there are about 5 to 6 plants in each of these lines. This gives us about 25 to 30 kale or chard plants in each of the beds. That's about 600 plants total. That's a lot of plants, a lot of good vegetables there. Now, in addition to the kale and the chard plants in each box, you'll also find one of my favorite little plants called sweet alyssum. It's got small white sweet-smelling flowers, and it's growing on the edge of each of the planters. The alyssum was planted there to help us to control one of our worst pests in vegetables, the aphid. I'll tell you a little bit more about this in another video, but what I just wanted you to be aware of is when you harvest your kale and chard plants, just leave the alyssum alone so that it can help us to control aphids. When you're harvesting the kale and the chard, you also might find a few weeds growing in between the plants. You could just pull those out and leave them on the soil surface where they'll decompose. We want to make sure that we get the weeds pulled out before they make any seeds. But before you pull anything out, please check with your teacher to make sure that you aren't pulling out a plant that we actually want to keep. So how do you harvest the kale and the chard leaves? I suggest using a scissors. To do this, you're going to pick one of the plants and you're going to start cutting off the leaves closest to the soil surface and passing them to one of your friends. You're slowly going to work your way up the plant. When you do this, make sure that you only cut the leaves, not the main stem of the plant. I left about 3 to 4 open leaves on this plant, and these will be ready to harvest in about a week. As you're harvesting the leaves, think of this as a way to thin out the canopy and make it a little bit less crowded. Any leaves that look old or yellow and not very good to eat, you should just cut off and leave them on the soil surface to decompose. Now, if your teacher doesn't want to harvest the bed more than once, you could just cut off all the leaves and get the bed ready for your next vegetable planting. So a really important question to ask is, how often can you harvest? Well, because the boxes have lots of plants, they can probably be harvested about once every week or so. When you notice that the leaves from neighboring plants are starting to crowd each other out, it's time to harvest again. I think we can expect to harvest each of the beds for about 4 to 8 weeks, assuming that we start around the middle to latter part of February. One more real important last thing before we finish is every time you harvest your bed, I suggest that you record the date and the weight of your harvest. You might even, for fun, want to count how many leaves you harvested. This way we can keep track of how much food we've produced and make comparisons as to how things grew in different parts of the garden. Now, the other day I harvested a few plants from a few beds and used this to estimate how much kale and chard we might be able to produce from each of the beds. I estimate that for each bed of kale, we'll produce about 1,000 to 2,000 grams, and for each bed of chard, we'll produce about 2,000 to 3,000 grams every time we harvest. Chard leaves tend to be a lot larger than kale leaves, and they also have a thicker midrib, which makes them heavier than the kale leaves. Okay, well, I hope that this has helped you to get a feel for how to go about harvesting the nutritious kale and chard that we've grown in our beautiful garden at Lincoln Elementary School. Have fun and enjoy the vegetables.